Just a few seconds and it should start. Sorry, not Twitter, on YouTube.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, right. Just a few seconds. Good. So I think now we are all set. And today we have the first seminar of a series of about innovation and development. And our guest is Cecilia Gregersen. And we are very happy to have you here today. Thank you for accepting the invitation. Cecilia holds an MSc in Business and Development Studies at the Copenhagen Business School, and she's currently a PhD fellow at Aalborg University. If I'm not wrong, you are almost done. So
almost.
Good. So, Cecilia, for her thesis, but we will hear about some of the result of her thesis just in a moment. She has been working on renewable electrification in Kenya, but maybe not only in Kenya, no? But you will tell us more. So today she will present us a paper on renewable electrification in Kenya, a sectoral innovation perspective. We have just been talking with the class about innovation system, but we haven't really talked too much about sectoral innovation system, so it's a great opportunity. So I just leave you the floor, and thank you very much again, and I'm looking forward to hear what you are going to tell us today.
Okay.
So I think you can share your screen.
I'm going to try to share my screen now. I think it's this. Let's see.
Yeah.
Can you see a presentation now?
Yes, perfect.
Yes.
You can just start, please.
Yes. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to speak to you today. This presentation, the title on it is slightly different because this is the title of my PhD. So my PhD is overall about learning for renewable electrification. And I specifically go in and study learning and capability building in wind power mega projects. So that's the overall title of my PhD. But as Roberta said, today I'd like to just tell you a little bit about the background of the Irec project, which is the project that I'm doing my PhD as part of. Then I'll briefly introduce you a bit to my PhD project, what I've chosen to do. And then, as Roberta said, I'll present to you some of the findings of one of the journal articles I've been part of writing as part of my PhD, which takes this sectoral innovation systems perspective on the renewable energy sector in Kenya. So I just wanted to tell you a bit about my personal background, how I ended up doing this PhD. As Roberta said, I have a master's degree in business and development studies from Copenhagen Business School. And already in my master thesis, I looked a little bit about innovation in renewable energies in Kenya, but it was more focused on small scale startups and things like solar home systems and efficient cook stoves. But so my interest in this topic started already in my master thesis, but then after my thesis, I did 2 years of work experience at the European Center for Development Policy Management in Maastricht, the Netherlands, which was more focused on overall EU development programming. It's a think and do tank, so it was still research-based work. I did a lot of interviews and was part of writing reports, but more focused on development programming. But then I got the opportunity to join the Irec project, and I've always been interested since my master thesis on this cross-section between renewable energy, development more broadly, and innovation. So the Irec project is a great great way to get further into that interest. So the project is called Irec Project, which stands for Innovation and Renewable Electrification in Kenya. Overall, we focus on renewable energy technologies, capability building, but also more broadly about sustainable industrialization in Kenya. And it's a 5-year collaborative research project between Aalborg University in Denmark and Moi University and the African Center for Technology Studies in Kenya. It's financed by the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it's gone a little bit over 5 years now, but here's just a few pictures of the team and some of the activities we've done. We've had workshops every year where we come together to share results and done some different field trips. So we went to visit the Nordic Folk Center for Renewable Energy here in northern Denmark one day, and saw lots of different models of small wind turbines that have been developed and tested there. But so I'm one of 3 PhD students in the project, and we've sort of been divided up into different sectors. So my project focuses specifically on large grid-connected wind power projects. And then my colleagues, Faith Wandera and Dominic Samoita from Moi University in Kenya, have looked at the small-scale wind power project sector and the solar sector. And it's an interdisciplinary project. So Dominic, he's actually an engineer and has looked a lot about performance of solar power projects in Kenya. But so the overall aim within the project is to provide better and more relevant knowledge regarding the opportunities afforded by these low carbon technologies, wind and solar, and looking into how can they be more effectively introduced to also build up production and innovation capabilities in Kenya, so that you're not only reducing energy poverty by adding electricity to the grid and access to the population through mini grids and standalone systems, but also more broadly, how can you help to create jobs and business activity in the process of electrification? So I just wanted to show you this figure, which is from the overall Irec framework. And so it explains a bit about what is the process of renewable electrification. So when we look at it, we're not only looking at this delivery of new and improved electricity services, which is sort of the arrow that goes upwards. So the primary benefit of renewable electrification is expanding access to electricity in the country and the use of this electricity. But we look at it as this dual process. So down below, you see that there can also be a focus on creating co-benefits, which is this new economic activities and capability building in the process. So what kind of jobs and activities are occurring in this process of installing and creating new energy infrastructure through solar and wind power projects. So in the end, both of these both directions will contribute to a sustainable industrialization in Kenya, because you can get industrial gains from this increased electricity production and use, where you could maybe say there will be more manufacturing and so on. But there will also be industrial gains from the capabilities and knowledge that is built up through the process of renewable electrification. So this is the overall framework within which my PhD was conducted. And also, I just wanted to say that this figure is from a book that has just been published with a lot of results from the Irec project. So I've added a link to this book in the end if you're more interested in this overall framework and process. So my PhD, I started in October 2016, and normally it's a 3-year process, but I've had a few babies along the way. So I'm just about finishing up now, and I'm due to hand in here in April. So I'm in the final phase of writing up. And I've chosen to do an article-based PhD, which means in my department at Aalborg University, that means we have to write 4 research papers and a synopsis, which sort of brings the papers together and has an overall research question and objective. Why do these different papers contribute to the same aim? So the overall objective across my 4 papers is to contribute to the understanding of why, how, and through which mechanisms local learning and technological capabilities may arise from renewable energy projects, and most specifically, large wind power projects. But I'll come back to the issue of large wind power projects. First, I wanted to just tell you a bit more about the context. Obviously, I'm looking into Kenya, but I've also done a case study of wind power project in Ethiopia, which is the neighboring country. And what you have to understand about both systems is that they've been undergoing a very big transformation in terms of both the energy mix, so which different kinds of sources of electricity do they use, and the process in which they're expanding their electricity access. So both countries have had very low electrification rates around at the turn of the millennium. In Kenya, only 15% of the population had access to electricity, but within 15 to 20 years now, they have increased that in a very ambitious program. So now about 75% of the population has access to electricity, whether that is the actual national electricity grid, which has been expanded to a lot of regions of the country, but also through a lot of mini grids and standalone solar systems where you have one system that just supplies to a village, for example. And this process is also occurring in the context of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're obviously also, both countries have put in place very ambitious programs to achieve SDG 7, which is about affordable and clean energy. So the goal is to achieve universal access to affordable electricity by 2030. But we're also looking into SDG 8, which is about industry, innovation, and infrastructure. So how to build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusivity and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. So it's, how can we look holistically at the process within the context of these two goals? And both countries have put into place, as I said, very ambitious programs to meet these goals within the next decade. So back to the large wind power sector. And I thought this is a very interesting sector to investigate in these two countries. It's very recent that you've been adding wind power to the grids in these two countries. In Kenya, there are two operational large grid-connected wind power projects. The first one is in Ngong Hills, which was completed in 2015 and added 25 megawatts to the national grid. So it's actually quite a small project, but it's still categorized as large and grid connected. But when you look at the next project, so the Lake Turkana wind power project, they added 310 megawatts of wind power to the national grid, and it became operational in 2018. And just to put that into context, it's a very, very, very big project because 310 megawatts is about 17% of the total electricity capacity in Kenya. So one single project was added about 17% of the electricity in Kenya. And then in Ethiopia, we see they had a bit of a quicker start to adding wind power. They have 3 operational projects. The first one, Adama 1, was added in 2012 and it was 51 megawatts. So again, a little bit smaller. But then in 2013, the next project, Ashigoda, added 120 megawatts. And finally, in 2015, the Adama 2 project was completed and added 153 megawatts. And again, that's a very big project. And I just wanted to highlight that and added these red asterisks at each of these projects. When they were completed, they were Africa's largest wind power projects. So they've been very debated publicly, and there's a lot of news around these projects because it is sort of, transformational. And so that's why I want to tell you a bit about this, the characteristics of these large wind power, and as I call them, mega projects. They're typically very large and complex projects. They involve a broad range of stakeholders from both the private sector and the public sector. They're usually met by very, very long planning phases. So if you look at the Lake Turkana project in Kenya, it was first, the idea was first put on the table in 2006, but it wasn't completed until 2018. So it's over 10 years from its initial startup to actually being completed. So they're very long planning phases, and they are often met by delays and critique, which is in particular the case in Lake Turkana. It was delayed for about 2 years from the construction was completed till it actually started producing electricity, because the transmission line to connect the project to the grid was very delayed. So as much as they are critiqued, they're also seen as very ambitious and potentially transformational projects. Each one of them has set Kenya and Ethiopia on the map as like forerunners in the expansion of renewable energy in Africa. So they're ambitious and seen as potentially very transformational, because they sort of, they're seen as flagship projects for the region. But another thing to just think about when you look at projects is that projects have a beginning and an end, which mean that they're temporal. So when you're looking at issues like learning and employment, they will always be sort of temporal in nature. Many people and companies will be employed for very specific phases of the project. So, and then move on. So what I deal with in my PhD is a bit about who is learning what and when. So what learning is sticking with who, and what do they then go on to use that learning for afterwards. And then this slide is about the wind power value chain, which is again just to add to this point that these are very complex operations when you have to look at it in terms of technology and capability building, because basically you can say that it's this is sort of taken from the value chain's perspective. It's a bit of a two-pronged value chain where you can look at the technology itself. So the wind turbines, how are they manufactured, designed, who's doing that, and where is that happening? And that is a value chain that you can look at in parallel to what we call the deployment chain, which is actually getting this technology into use. So the planning and assessing and the finance of starting a wind power project, then the deployment, the actual construction and transportation of the technology to the site, and the connection of the site to the national grid. And then we have the post-deployment, the operation and maintenance of a wind power project. Usually they have a lifetime of around 20 years. So we have these complex value chains with many different things going on, a lot of different people coming in with different input. And it's both temporal, as I said, that there's a start and an end to the project, but it's also spans a long, long time, from a 10-year planning phase to a 20 to 25-year operational phase. So you have this very long-term process, but also very temporal activities of a project-based nature along every step of the way. So that's a bit about the framework, how I think about these mega projects when I have to think about learning and capability building. You have learning that can occur in many different stages and by many different individuals and organizations that are involved along the way. So my research design is the in-depth case study method. I think it's using these projects as case studies makes you able to sort of look at the context and the phenomena of learning and capability in a specific context. But you also can start to compare the different projects, even though every country has specific contextual dimensions. You can also say, but these projects are similar in certain ways, in the ways in which what organizations come in and do what. I have gathered mainly qualitative data for my PhD based on semi-structured interviews, and it's a purposeful sampling strategy. Obviously, I have my decision on case studies based on there's not that many projects that exist, but also which ones are the biggest and most critical or transformational. But then there's this limitation to to my design, which is the time dimension. As I said, there's a long planning phase and a long operational phase, and I can only come in and sort of interview people at a certain time in this project's lifetime. So how do I make sure that I have as dynamic a possible snapshot of this long-term process? Which is why I would argue that qualitative data was so important in this process. By interviewing people involved in the projects, I could get their stories about from project developers. What was it like when this project started? What was the planning phase like? And then to look into the future, I've had to try to talk to the people who are actually operating and maintaining the projects now. So what kind of, how do they manage the operations and the dynamics of the teams who have to keep these turbines running? So that's why interviews is so key in this place, because you kind of have to get an idea of what happened before and what's going to happen in the future. So that's just a little bit about my methodology. I also just wanted to tell you a bit about doing fieldwork in this sector, and how do you go about getting empirical evidence. So as I said, it's mainly qualitative data. I have my interviews, recordings, and notes. And then, I went to visit the two projects, where I then could have more casual discussions with the people on the working on the project. But also, I mean, throughout the process, and luckily, because these projects are very publicly debated, I've been able to gather a lot of different presentations and documents about the projects, different reports. But what was very important for me was actually the contextual learning, where I actually was able to go and visit these project sites, even if it was just for one day or half a day, just to see it in praxis was, I think, a very important part of the process for me. Another thing about fieldwork is the issue of getting access and the network. So being part of the Irec project was very useful in terms of being able to introduce yourself to stakeholders and different contacts, and have opportunities for dissemination of the research results. This was also, I mean, part of it came through being part of the Irec project, but was also important to sort of along the process to keep this in mind. And then I just wanted to show you a few pictures about from these projects. I was able to visit them in 2017. The Lake Turkana project in Kenya is in a very, very remote site. So it's actually very difficult to plan and get access to this project, because you need to fly with the project plane that actually transports engineers to and from site. It operates a bit like an offshore oil plant, where employees come and have shifts where they stay on the project site for a few weeks or months and then go home for a month or so. You can't just drive to the site. It's very, very far away from the capital city, Nairobi. So when I did get access, I was able to visit the project for one day. It's a huge project site. There's about 365 wind turbines that have been put up across a very large area. But it's interesting when you visit these sites. I got a tour of the site by an engineer. So coming from a business background, there was a lot to learn in terms of the technical aspects of visiting a power plant, looking at, what are these things I take pictures of, like the substation where all the power is connected to the national grid, and different kinds of generators used at different points of connection. So yeah, there's a lot of technical details that you sort of have to get a grasp of when visiting a big engineering electrical site like this, which was an interesting experience for me without that much of a knowledge. I mean, I spent a lot of the first year of my PhD learning a bit about wind turbines and the technology, but there's so much there that you don't really know about. But that's why for me it was a really good experience to come and visit the site and see what's going on, and what are all these little details. And then this is the visit to the Adama 2 site in Ethiopia. That was a very different experience doing fieldwork in Ethiopia, getting access to the project. There was a lot of suspicion of me as a foreign researcher, why I was coming, what I wanted to look into. So in Ethiopia, I had to have a collaboration with the Adama Science and Technology University and a supervisor who you can see here on the pictures, who actually physically brought me along to all the interviews and introduced me and was sort of, he vouched for me during the whole visit. But here it was very exciting. I actually got to go up inside a wind turbine and sit on the top of one for the first time. And yeah, it's a little pleasure, but it was a very, very cool experience to actually be on top of. I mean, I don't remember exactly how many meters, if it was 30 or 50 meters high, but it's a unique experience. And again, it involved a lot of looking at technical bits and pieces. In this picture with the blue, that's actually inside the nacelle of the turbine, which is where the gearbox is. And yeah, so there's a lot of technical things to understand as well when you get on a tour visit like this, but it's a great experience. And yeah, that's just a little bit about fieldwork and visiting project sites. Again, I think the main challenge was getting access, getting the permission to go. Yes, so that's a bit summing up what I've just talked a bit about. Getting permission and the logistics of traveling to remote project sites is a major challenge when doing research like this. You only have limited time at the project site, so 1 day or half a day actually looking at the project. And so before and after this, it was a long process of identifying and contacting the most suitable respondents. And here again about sampling. So in an ideal sample, I would have liked to try to speak to project managers from all subcontractors of the project. That's a very ambitious goal because, as I showed you on the value chain, there's so many different people involved. So what happened more realistically was that I was able to get 41 interviews in total. And most important was the interviews with the project developers, because these are the people who've been involved in the project from the start. And even though they're not actually part of the construction, they have been part of planning the construction. So they know who is chosen for what specific tasks and why. And then in the end, I was able to interview some of the key contractors. So in this case, what I was really interested in was who is the technology provider and who is doing the maintenance and operation of the project once it's producing electricity. So in Lake Turkana, that's the Vestas, the Danish wind turbine producer. So I was able to interview their project manager. And in Ethiopia, it's Chinese technology, a company called Hydro China, who was the project manager. And they also are the people responsible for training the Ethiopian engineers who will maintain the project. It was a Chinese wind turbine called Sani that was used for that project. So that's what I was realistically able to do, was to talk to the developers who had an idea of sort of the history of the project, and then the key contractors who will be maintaining and operating the projects in the end. So that was what I wanted to just sort of tell you about my PhD project, the overall setting and context. And now I was going to move on to the journal article that I wanted to present to you about renewable electrification in Kenya. I don't know if we should break for questions after I've presented this too. Okay.
Yeah, maybe we can just have questions at the end.
Yes, okay. So this is an article that I have co-authored with colleagues from the Irec project. We take the sectoral innovation systems perspective, which is widely used to analyze innovation in specific sectors. So for example, the telecom sector or the chemical sector. And in this case, you could say the renewable energy sector in Kenya. So what is a sector? There's a specific technology which is in use, and who are the actors then involved in diffusing and deploying that technology. So the research question is, how do wind and solar markets in Kenya differ in terms of development and organization, both across and within sectors. So we wanted to investigate how whether and how innovation dynamics depend on the shape of technology, which is whether it's a solar technology or a wind technology, but also the size of the project or deployment of the technology. So is this a small scale project or a large scale project? So yeah, the interest is in looking, if you have an overall sector, the renewable energy sector, what can you learn from looking in more detail at different subsectors? So using the sectoral innovation systems framework, we focus on 3 main elements of the system. So we divided this into what are the knowledge and technologies in this sector, what are the actors and networks involved who are most important, and what different institutions shape the dynamics of these innovation systems. So we looked at, as I said, at 4 different subsectors. Within wind, you have the wind power mini grids, which are usually just a single wind turbine producing electricity or running a mill or something like that for a little one household or so. And then you have the grid connected wind power plants, which are the ones I talked to you about a bit earlier. There's 2, the Ngong project and the Lake Turkana wind power project. And again, this is the same in the solar PV sector. You have a lot of solar powered mini grids, which provide electricity to villages which are not connected to the national grid, or even I think in this analysis, we don't have standalone solar home kits, but yeah, you have this small scale deployment of solar energy. And then in Kenya, there was 1 large solar PV grid connected power plant at the time of research. There's since been added 1 more, but so this paper just takes into account the first one, which was a university project where they developed a solar system and got permission to connect it to the national grid. And this is a summary of some of our findings. I'm not going to go through all of the points in this table, but I just wanted to show you, so how did we use the sectoral innovation systems framework to look at each of these subsectors. So here we have a summary of our analysis of what are the key knowledge and technologies in each of these grids or each of these subsectors. Who are the actors and networks involved, and what are the institutions that help shape the dynamics of each of these subsectors. And I just I've just highlighted a few things in red to show you an example of the variation across the different sectors. So if you look at the knowledge used in each of these sectors, in the wind mini grid sector, we found that it was mainly informal learning and knowledge that was involved. Many of these small wind turbines were very small and simple, and it was actually local craftsmen and engineers who had helped to put them up. Then when you look at the large-scale wind projects, what is used is a lot of formalized research and development in large-scale wind turbines from leading companies like Vestas, who produce wind turbines. So that's a very different kind of knowledge. It's technical and engineering based disciplines that are used, and it's formalized in this R&D process. Then when you look at the solar mini grids, you also find engineering based knowledge. It's a lot of different European and private suppliers of mini grids who have come into Kenya to set these up. And what you also see is that you need a lot of expertise in the telecom sector, because many of them are operated with mobile payment schemes and pay-as-you-go models where users can just top up to get a little bit more electricity. And then when you look at the large-scale solar project, again, it's this engineering based knowledge. And this case, it came from the university. So the engineering department of a university was part of setting up this large-scale solar project. So that's just to show you the variation that we found within each of these subsectors, it's rather large. There's some similarities across sectors, but you can also see in wind, for example, is a huge difference between the small scale wind sector and the large scale wind sector. And again, you can also see that in the solar sector, there's a specific kind of knowledge that is needed for the solar mini grids, which you don't see in the large scale solar projects, where you have this focus on the telecom access or telecom expertise in terms of payment schemes. So that's if I've added a link to or a reference to the article at the end. So if you want to know more details, you can read the whole article or look at this. I'll share the slides with you afterwards so you can see this table again. But so what can we conclude from doing an analysis like this? First of all, we can say there are profound differences between solar and wind technologies, but equally important differences within these technologies. So in terms of looking at the system dimensions, we actually found in the end that there was a greater similarity between the large scale projects. So the size of projects, there was similarity between large scale wind projects and solar projects, and then more differences to the projects within the same technology. So the similarity was more about the size of the project rather than the actual technology in use. And that basically means that one size fits all policies are just not suitable for the renewable energy sector, but rather you have to think about the pathways across the different sizes and shapes of technologies we've outlined in the article. So yeah, when you look at the renewable energy sector, it's not just one big sector that acts in the same way. In fact, there's very many different dynamics going on if you look at it at a subsectoral level. So the conclusion to this is that we believe that policies can help shape the dynamics of each of these subsectors. When you take this sectoral perspective, you can actually you really see how innovation systems are outcomes of interaction and co-evolution across both the size and shape. So I think when you look at these subsectors, what we found out is it also is about trends across national borders and links to the global industry trends. So for example, the small scale wind sector in Kenya was not very connected to the international industry. It was a lot of local craftsmen and engineers just tinkering about and putting things together. But when you look at the large scale wind and across the solar sector, you had a lot of different foreign actors coming in with expertise and really shaping the dynamics of those sectors. And when you look at them across the sectors in terms of knowledge and learning, it becomes clear that knowledge created in specific sectors are not necessarily easily acquired or transferred across the sectors. So in terms of policy, you have to think about, well, how can we shape the dynamics of each of these sectors, but what's also not easily transferable across, and where do we have to set in and think individually about these, or more holistically, how can we create learning across these sectors? Yeah, so these variations raise questions about how can you build up the necessary capabilities and expertise within the local market? How can you make sure that local actors have a chance to come in and contribute to these projects? What are the barriers for entry for local firms? When you look at a large project like Lake Turkana wind power project, there's a lot of barriers for local firms to actually participate in the project, because you have this very large scale sort of world leading, here comes Vestas with their wind turbines, and you can't just have any local company come and help operate and maintain them. But we did find examples where local companies could come in and, for example, in the transportation of wind turbines from the port where they arrive, they're built in a factory in China. So you had a lot of surveys done to how to actually transport these wind turbines from the port to the site. And in the end, it was actually a local Kenyan firm that was able to do that, but they had to do a lot of, they had to acquire new trucks and things to actually be able to physically move these large elements of wind turbines to the site, but it was possible. So yeah, there's a lot of questions you can discuss further about what kind of capabilities and expertise are used from local companies and what comes in from abroad, and how can you think about what you want to, how do you want to shape that? So yeah, in the end, the conclusion is that policies which are not one size fit all for renewable energies, but that look at more these subsectoral dynamics can help shape those dynamics. That was a very quick summary of that article. Maybe I went a bit fast, but yeah, that's what I wanted to present to you. And I have a few extra slides with some details if anybody wants to know more. It can get very technical, as I said, with these contracts and technologies. So I wasn't sure how much to go into those details. But yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. And as I said, we have an open access book called this, I have a little thumbnail here, Building Innovation Capabilities for Sustainable Industrialization, which brings together a lot of the results from the Irec project. So I've been part of a few of the chapters where we both bring in some more of my work on the case study from Ethiopia. But more specifically, yeah, have a lot of different details about the Kenyan energy sector. And then this is the reference to the article that I was presenting some of my results from. Yep, so that's what I had to start out with, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think it has been very, very useful and full of insights. I mean, I think I really appreciated your description also of how you have been doing the field work, and I think also for the students here is very insightful, also in terms of how to do research, how to structure a field work. So great, and also I would say, but maybe we can hear also from the question more, that a lot of insights are connecting very well to a number of issues that we have been doing and looking at in these days. For instance, I was just thinking about your big table about learning channels and how learning channels could be very different from one sector to the other, how in some situation codified knowledge it is more important and how in other while in other for instance, subsector, but also within the same subsector in different size of plant is more uncodified knowledge. So, I mean, we have been looking at all this concept kind of more from a theoretical perspective. So I think it's great to see how this concept could be really used for doing research, for understanding the dynamics of different sectors in different countries. So, I mean, I think I have also a few questions, but I think we can both use the chat from home, or you can just open your microphone and ask your question. Maybe I don't see all of you, so maybe you just, so I don't see if you raise of your hand from home, but you can maybe just write your questions or just open your mic and your microphone and speak. And from the students who are here, if anyone would like to ask question, I will have to ask you to come down here, because otherwise who is at home is not going to listen to what you want to say. Do you have any question here? Okay, please come down, and also give me your, because I see the name of the students from home, but I don't know yet your name. So the surname maybe is easier.
Okay, I try.
Yes, please. But you're so Giorgio?
Giorgio Tascone.
Tascone.
Yes.
Okay, great. Fine. Please go ahead.
Okay.
I think you can just speak and see if, let me see if it's, is it? No, it's not. Wow, yes, it's good. So try and see if I listen to you.
Okay,
we can hear you.
Thank you very much for.
Okay, just, can you hear from home?
Yes, yes, I can hear. I'm gonna try.
Okay, please.
Thank you very much for being here. And I wanted only to ask to a so young person that I think is difficult in a global context to work, like in the case of a so important project, particularly for a PhD, but it's not the key point of my questions. I wanted to ask about the sectoral innovation system, not about knowledge and technology or actors and network, but about institutions. I think it's very important, the organizational aspect. And how is easy or difficult, I repeat, for a so young person to adapt and to understand all the context I repeat, in international level, to understand all the institution and different actors that works and links together in a so important project like, in your case, the PhD. How have you been able to adapt and to understand and to work for, in this case, I've seen that at the start of your speech, you're speaking about that the Danish government has financed your PhD, and it's interesting that at the end of all, at the end of the conclusion, there was written in the case of institution in the large scale. Was written financial support from donors and development banks. I wanted to know if only the Danish government has supported your PhD project, or also many other institutions, and for example, governments or private banks have helped you, and in this case, your cooperated fight together and Dominic Samoita in this project. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. I think there is another question from here, and then please come down, and then maybe you can answer, and we see if there are questions from home. So, your name? Okay, please.
Hi, my name is Beatrice. I just wanted to ask a quick question. I believe that the renewable energy sector represents a challenge both for developing or emerging countries such as Kenya, but also for developed countries such as Denmark or Italy. So I just wanted to ask if, would you say that the methods and the techniques that you implied during your research in Kenya may be useful also for a research project on innovation projects in developed or industrialized countries? Thank you.
More questions from here? Not for the moment. Okay. Do you want to start answering and then we see?
Yeah, I think we can group them a bit. So I'll answer these two first, and then we can take some more. Okay, so I wrote down here. So the first question, it touched a bit about being a young person working on a PhD, funding issues, so funding for my project, but also there was something about understanding institutions in the sectoral innovations perspective. And for example, in the large scale wind sector, who were the funders, there was, let me just go back to the slide with that. Here. So yeah, what kind of donor support there was for different projects. That's how I understood the question. So first of all, about being a young researcher and a PhD student, for me, it's been very valuable to be doing my PhD as part of the Irec project, because it's meant that I had colleagues. As I said, it's funded by the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but it was that issue of the funding came before me as a PhD. So basically here in Denmark, there's a large research funding process where different universities can apply for funding and then get funding for projects like the Irec project. So it's been through, I think, 2 rounds to finalize that process. So when I arrived as a PhD student, I was very lucky and privileged to have a project that was fully funded, had a framework, and then I just had to write an application to become part of the project. So myself, I did not actually have to work on funding the PhD project. I applied to a funded position. So that I was very lucky and privileged to do that. But there are many projects out there. If you are interested in a PhD, you just have to do a lot of research, different university projects. Yeah, I have enjoyed having a funded position, which gave me a framework to sort of start my journey in the PhD. So that helped me frame my initial project. Obviously, there's another way of doing it where you have an idea for your project that you have to start to define. I would say always get advice from a professor who can help you. How could I turn this into a fundable project? But again, having the colleagues in the Irec project meant that my, for example, the sectoral innovations system paper, I was a co-author. So I had colleagues from the Irec project, both senior. We were 4 or 5 authors on this paper. Ulrik Elmer Hansen is a colleague from the Danish Technical University who has been part of the Irec project. So it was sort of a collaborative process where we pulled together all of our different desk research on these different sectors, because we knew that each one of us was responsible for a certain sector. So I came with mostly input for this paper on the large-scale wind sector and could describe the projects that I have been looking at in terms of my PhD, and then my colleagues came with information on the solar and mini grid wind sector. So I think it's very important part of the process to work with others. As a PhD student, you're learning, and you learn from working with your senior colleagues. So I did not manage to write this paper on my own. This is a collaborative piece of work where we've all joined together with our different knowledge, and it's a great process. To learn to write a journal article, it takes a long time. So it's very good to start out working with others who've been through that process before and can advise you on how to set this up. So it is very difficult. I would say you're right. It's hard sometimes to, where do you set the limit on your analysis? I think that's very important in terms of the institutions. The question about the institutional part of the sectoral analysis, you have to just be very clear about what you're including and what you're not including. So in this, to give you a bit more details about the institutions in the large-scale wind sector, there was financial and advisory support from both donors and development banks. And what actually occurred in this case was that a large pool of different funding institutions came together to finance this project. Both the Danish and the Norwegian and the Finnish and some international, the World Bank was also approached at one process, but it's a long process where different funders had been approached and decided to come together, and then some of them left again. So it's with a project as big as Lake Turkana, you have a lot of different funders coming together to work. It's not just one government financing this project. I think maybe that answers the first question.
Yeah. Can I just add something which is in relation of I mean, your PhD project and is also based on my experience for my PhD quite a long time ago. I think that to be part of a project is of course also great in terms of getting accessibility to local institutions.
Yes.
I mean, for me, it was the same in a completely different context. I did some interviews with shoe manufacturers in Mexico, and I did interviews in 2 different locations, and in one of them I had a connection with a local chamber of commerce, basically, and it was great. I mean, it was very easy, and they opened me up all the. I did interviews to firms, so it was easy to connect to them. In the other location, I didn't have such a kind of institutional connection, and it was immensely more difficult to get access to firms, because usually, I mean, and at that time it was probably a bit easier than today, but I mean, firms, they are not available to, I mean, they don't want, they see as a kind of waste of time to speak with students, PhD students, researchers. So, I mean, I think that in your case, the fact that you have been able to get access to, I mean, some of the people you have been able to interview, of course, as a PhD student within a project, it's a completely different situation when you are a PhD student just pursuing your research project, because it's much more difficult to get other people involved. So I think this is also an important, at least for my reading of your story and my experience, it's very, I think it's very important, not to be part of a project. It's really great.
Definitely. I can only confirm being part of the Irec project meant I already had a collaboration with Moi University in Kenya, just institutionally, the way I was introduced. And in the beginning of the project, our first workshop in Kenya, we actually did some joint interviews. So that's when I had my first contact to one of the directors of the Lake Turkana project, when we approached him as a research team with senior researchers from Aalborg University and Moi University in Kenya. And then we had our first meeting where we met with this director. And then when I went back as a PhD student, I could follow up on that meeting and say, here I am, and I want to do some more research on this. So that was definitely the reason that I was able to get access to that project. And as Roberta says, I had a very different experience in Ethiopia, because I didn't have that initial institutional contact from the project. It was actually a very a lucky connection from a colleague who was part of this Africalix network. So the African innovation, I don't know if Roberta has talked to you about the Globelix network, but it's a global network on innovation and learning dynamics. And so this global network has regional chapters, and there's an African network on learning and innovation dynamics, and they have PhD academies and conferences. So it was actually through a colleague from that network that I gained access to the Adama Science and Technology University. And it was only because I was able to get a research permit and this supervisor, a professor from the university who physically brought me around to all of my meetings. That was the only reason I got access to that project and to the actual project site, because in Ethiopia, it was a very interesting setup where the government of Ethiopia had decided that they wanted different universities to be part of the wind power project. So they had a team of consultants from different universities on these different projects, and my supervisor was one of the lead consultants for that project. So that's how I gained access to that project. So again, identifying sort of gatekeepers is very important for doing fieldwork, and being part of a project is a very big benefit in this case. Doing research in Kenya and Ethiopia, that was key to gaining access. And then maybe to move on to the other question about how could these methods...
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but I think there is a question in the chat which is more related again to, I mean, how the building up of your PhD. So,
Yes.
So maybe we can just.
I can't see the chat right now. I'm not sure how to. So if you could maybe tell me the question.
Yeah, sure. So Andrea is asking, well, he's saying a pleasure to listen your very interesting experience, and he's asking about how much important has been teamwork and brainstorming in the construction of your project, and also, I mean, he would like to know more about the multidisciplinary approach of a team involved in the project.
Yes, so having a team to collaborate with was very important in the beginning, especially doing a PhD is actually a very lonely process, I can say now at the end of it. So sort of coming on board and having these workshops every 6 months to every year, we had a workshop where we came together all together. That was, I mean, the highlight of my PhD process was coming together with colleagues to be able to present and discuss and get feedback, because otherwise you're sitting with your project alone in your office most of the time, and it does get very, very lonely, I have to say. It's not been easy, but when you look back, you can see how hard it was. But you know, as long as you have some points out that also going to conferences and sort of it's scary to present your work when it's not quite done. As a first year PhD, you feel very inexperienced. I know in the context of things, you actually have a lot of experience, but when you go to a conference or so, it can be a bit daunting, but it's definitely the highlight of the PhD experience when you get to discuss your work with colleagues who are interested and have questions and make you think about it in different ways. So definitely very important part of the process. Was there more to the question? I've already forgotten now.
No, sorry. And then the question, I mean,
the second question from the room was about the renewable energy sector and whether the methods and techniques could also be transferred to other developed and industrialized countries. Definitely. I mean, that's what, when you look at these large scale wind power projects, they are more similar in terms of how they occur around the world than they are to the national context. You have international technology suppliers coming in with wind turbine technologies. You have these sort of international project management firms that come in and manage these projects in a very tight project management way. So I would say definitely you could use the same framework to look at other wind power projects. Again, the key issue is how to get access to these projects. A benefit of the projects that I looked at was that they are these very publicly debated projects. There's a lot of news articles about it. So the project developers were also interested in telling their version of the story and why they've taken decisions to do what they do. And I think you could do the same with a lot of wind power projects in Europe, in Denmark. There's the same kind of debates within local communities, whether they accept the project, what are the benefits, how many people can get jobs, what kind of jobs come. So yeah, you definitely could transfer a lot of this to other countries. What is unique to the context in Kenya and Ethiopia is perhaps this process of electrification where you're choosing wind and solar power technologies over other technologies. Yeah, so it's looking at the different mix of technologies used in different countries and how does that shape the dynamics of each of these projects. What are you competing with? Is it geothermal or hydropower or fossil fuels? There was while I've been doing my PhD, there's been a lot of debate about a big fossil fuel plant that they wanted to develop in Kenya. And while there's been a lot of critique about the Lake Turkana wind power project too, in terms of bringing in local communities and what kind of jobs were created and displacement of villages for the project site. So there's been a lot of critique about the project, but in the end, everybody is still super positive about adding wind power to the grid in Kenya. Where there was actually a big fossil fuel plant, which was stopped because of the public critique of why are we adding a diesel power plant to the grid when we now see what's possible with other technologies. So, I mean, the overall framework about capabilities and learning and creating jobs from these kind of projects is, I'd say, universally transferable, but the contextual elements about what dynamics shape these projects is obviously going to be different in each country. But you have this, I'd say the overall idea about looking at them as mega projects is also very transferable, where you have these long, complex projects that are often criticized by different stakeholder groups, is also another transferable framework.
Thank you, thank you. So more questions from here? Oh.
I don't know if from the same person could be have the idea.
Okay, I ask you a question and maybe you can come down. No, I have a question which is more related to the content of your study. I would like to know more about the role of the foreign actors in the different projects, and in particular, I would like to know more about the experience of, successful experience of transferring knowledge from foreign actors to local actors in terms of creation of local activities. I've been reading in these days some of your stuff because we are working with Rasmus for UNTAD. So to know more, and it seems that Ethiopia has been somehow more successful. So if you can just tell us a little bit more about this.
Yeah. Okay. So the role of foreign actors in the different projects you see is that you have this, it's a very formalized R&D kind of knowledge that is needed. So you have these leading international wind technology producers who come into the picture. In my two case studies, we have the difference between a European Danish wind turbine producer and the Chinese wind turbine producer. And what you see in the operational phase of these projects is that they have very different approaches to how they want to service and maintain their technology. In the case of Lake Turkana, Vestas, I think, very strongly argued that they needed a 15-year service contract. So for the first 15 years of the wind power project's lifetime, it is Vestas who is responsible to have an engineering team on site which maintains the turbines. And what that then means is that they have had to hire a lot of local engineers who they then train in-house on how to maintain the wind turbines. So in the case of Lake Turkana, you have a lot of learning about the wind power technology, but basically what I would argue is that that learning is staying within the organizational framework of Vestas, the international company. So the foreign company is coming in with their technology and they are training local staff, but the knowledge that they are learning is not being transferred outside of the organization. I mean, to the extent of the first 15 years, if they can keep their engineers on site, they're keeping that knowledge within Vestas. Whereas you see in Ethiopia, the turbine provider does not have a service contract. Rather, it's the Ethiopian utility company who owns the project who has to sort of take over operations from the Chinese technology suppliers. So their agreement states that the technology suppliers from China have to come and train the engineers on site from the Ethiopian electricity utility firm, and then they have to maintain that knowledge within the organization to keep operating and maintaining the plant. So there you actually have a more direct transfer of knowledge from the foreign technology provider to the Ethiopian local authorities who are operating the project. So there you can see sort of the difference between intra-organizational learning, which is occurring within Vestas. They're still transferring knowledge, but to local engineers that are hired by Vestas. Whereas the other case, I think that's a very good example of how you can think about knowledge transfer. Is it going from a foreign actor to a local actor, or where is it getting transferred and where is that knowledge sticking? And then maybe another thing to mention in the case of Ethiopia, which I touched upon earlier, was that the government demanded that you have a formalized kind of technology and knowledge transfer, where they had universities apply to become a team of consultants who would act as the owner's consultant. So in Ethiopia, the projects are set up, they're owned by the national utility, state-owned utility firm, and they then have this team of university consultants who mediate the contract with the Chinese project developers. So in that setup, you have a lot of knowledge transfer from the Chinese project developers to the team of university consultants who are learning about how to project manage a wind power plant. This setup is not without its difficulties in terms of what's lost in translation, and there's maybe a bit more hesitance from the project developers to share certain knowledge with the consultants. There's sort of this contractual nature of the relationship, which had some friction. But I think it's a very interesting setup in terms of how can the government of Ethiopia say, we want to ensure that there's some kind of formalized technology transfer, and we think that universities are a relevant actor to involve in this process. Whereas in Kenya, it's an independent power project, which means that the project is owned by the project developers. It's not the state-owned utility which operates the plant. And the owners of Lake Turkana are a group of British Kenyans and Dutch men. So they would say that they are Kenyans, but I think you can there's a nuance to their how local they are. They're registered in Kenya, but then you have all of these different international funders. So the nature of what is a local firm is also something you can delve into in this setup, and how local are they in terms of they're harboring a lot of knowledge now about setting up such a huge power plant. But where do they go with that knowledge now? They own and operate Lake Turkana. Will they develop a new wind power plant in Kenya? What's, where does the knowledge that they now have about project managing a wind power farm go? Will it stay locally, or would they develop projects in other countries after this? That's something to look further into. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I think there is one more question here.
The last. Beg your pardon, is the last question. Sometimes knowledge means information.
I think, sorry, you have to.
Can you listen?
Yeah.
Okay. Sometimes knowledge means information, and sometimes it is also power. I wanted to know if you have found other sectors from different contexts that were there in the same context in which you were working. There were these correction people, actors, and maybe if you have worked together, maybe interacting in an interdependence context, and maybe if they have been able, for example, to capture knowledge, and if they wanted you to do the same project or different project, or you have been able to cooperate. I wanted to know if it has been possible or in this context to cooperate or not. Only this, because I know that zones of the world, also there is China that is having a big power, and maybe how it's possible to interact in this international and also sometimes difficult context.
Okay, let's see. I don't think there are more questions. Are more questions from home? No. I think, okay, so maybe Cecilia, if you want to
answer this question. Yeah, so I understand it as a bit about the power of knowledge and the issue of capturing versus sharing information in terms of what are you willing to share and how do you cooperate. So I have a lot of different reflections about that. You could look at it in many different ways. I mean, because I'm framing my PhD project in terms of systems and interactive learning, for me, sort of my sense is just to say, well, knowledge should be shared. It's good if it's shared, because then a lot of different actors can come and input differently, and there'll be more buildup of innovation capabilities the more the knowledge is shared widely across actors. But definitely there are dynamics where different technology providers are more or less willing to share information regarding their technology, getting access to companies like Vistas and the Chinese project developers in Ethiopia. That's definitely, when you talk to the project developers, they're very happy to share their story about the project, and they share openly because they want to give the projects good PR. But when you talk to the technology providers, you can definitely feel that there's more hesitance to share organizational information. So it's much harder to get access and permissions to talk to employees from Vistas or the Chinese technology supplier. But once you, I mean, I think it's about, as a PhD student, you can say, well, I'm looking at this purely from a research perspective. So all my interviews are confidential and anonymized, and I'm not sharing business secrets. But I know in other contexts, in Denmark, we have a lot of industrial PhDs, which means that companies part finance PhDs, and the PhD students get access to the companies and a lot of inside information. And then you would actually maybe end up with a confidential PhD, which is not shared. But I think my having an open access PhD is very important in terms of sharing knowledge and research. So yes, there's a lot of different dynamics at play, but it depends at which level you look at what's important to think about. And I can also mention that in Ethiopia, because there was this different setup where there was more intermediaries, there was a bigger hesitance to share, and there was a lot of challenges in terms of transferring knowledge from the Chinese to the consultants, for example, but also to the Ethiopian engineers on site. I did hear stories about not wanting to share certain product manuals and blueprints because they were afraid that the consultants maybe would take that and use it elsewhere. But also other kinds of challenges where things are lost in translation, or certain manuals came in with Chinese instructions. So the engineers couldn't actually understand what they needed. So there's many different levels and layers of analysis in that, but it's definitely an important thing to think about when you're looking at knowledge and information transfer.
Yeah, thanks. Just two small observations I would like to add. First of all, I mean, you have been talking several times about Vesta. I'm not sure everybody knows what Vesta is.
Yes.
Vesta is a big Denmark wind company, so probably the largest in the world, no?
I think they're definitely in the top three, I'd say.
It's a large wind manufacturing, producing turbines, so and doing many things in the wind industry, and with a lot of investment abroad also. So it was also involved in the Kenya project, no?
Yeah. They provided.
And another small observation. You were talking about this industrial PhD, and this is really go back to something I was discussing the other day about the different incentive. About openness of result of researcher versus companies, no? So I mean, the case you were presenting about student doing PhD within industry, within company, sorry, and this PhD at the end they are not available, they are not open, while usually a PhD is a contribution to science and must be openly available. So I think that this is a very good example of a different kind of attitude and incentive of sharing knowledge in firms with respect to academia and research in general. Okay. So more question here? No, and not from home. So I think it was really great. I mean, I really enjoy to listen to you and to listen more about these industries. So I mean, we wish all of us we wish you good luck for your PhD.
Thank you very much.
When do you expect to finish? When do you expect to finish?
I'm hoping to hand in end of April.
Okay,
so I have about 5 to 6 weeks left, and really in the last spurt.
Yeah. And it's true. I mean, I agree with Cecilia that a PhD is often a very lonely project because you are sitting there with your computer and you have to write. So I mean, really.
So I was very happy to get to talk to you today to break my silence in front of the computer for a little bit.
Okay, so thank you again. Have a good day, and I hope to see you soon somewhere. Okay,
thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. And okay.